Okay, so thanks so much for inviting me. And this is probably the last time I see your faces before I turn it down. Otherwise, I don't see my slides. But so thanks all for coming and for accommodating the slightly different time for your seminar. I was very pleased to be invited in this series, and I hope I have something to offer to you. Not because I don't think this is causation or causation in general is unrelated to emergence, quite the contrary, but because I was hoping to experiment with some ideas, and I will say a bit more later. But then I had to come to terms with my own diary, and then I decided that I should present something that is slightly more established in my research, and then tell you how this could be connected more explicitly with emergence. But one other reason why I think this topic may be of general interest is the idea of what we make of philosophical concepts, and especially concepts in philosophy of science. And causation is an excellent one to reflect upon. And what I want to suggest here is that whatever we develop at the conceptual level is bound to influence issues at the normative level. And so there is an important question to be asked about how we want to conceptualize something like causation. And I will take health and disease as a case in point, not as the only domain where such a discourse applies. But so this is to give you a general introduction of what I'm trying to do. And okay, now you can see the next one. So to try and make my point about the relevance of concepts at the epistemological level, also for normative questions, I will take a step back and start from a distinction between cross-cutting and domain-specific questions. So I will try to explain to you how I locate the question of health and disease within the landscape that is possible in philosophy of science. And then I will introduce the health sciences and public health and the philosophy thereof as something interesting that has happening in the philosophy of science, and one in which we can indeed try the strategy of addressing domain-specific questions, such as how to conceptualize health and disease in a way that exploits cross-cutting concepts. And this is what I take causality to be, a cross-cutting concept that works in very many different domains. And then the second part will be to link concept and actions. And again, in the first instance, the argument will be quite general, namely to ask what consequences should follow if we conceptualize this and that in a certain way, and then make this specific to the case of the health sciences for public health interventions. And so all this will lead me to discuss the non-neutrality of philosophy of science, and especially introduce the idea that concepts do promote values. We are used to discuss the value loudness of concepts, but I want to kind of turn the question upside down and ask instead, what kind of values can we promote if we opt for one conceptualization or the other? So this is the general plan for the talk. Let me begin then with the distinction between cross-cutting and domain-specific question. So this is a distinction that traces back to neopositivism and the philosophy of science that followed. And broadly, we can consider cross-cutting questions that really apply to domains generally. How do we explain? What are causes and effects? When is an experiment or a model or a method valid? Are types of questions that you can ask in very many different domains. And admittedly, the specific answer you may give will vary depending on where you are. But at the same time, remember that at least in the beginning, these general philosophy of science questions were really tailored or thought to be for physics, and then anything else was a special science. And as we progressed in philosophy of science, we kind of enlarged the basket of these domain-specific questions. What are genes? What is the Higgs mechanism? What is agency or a pathology? These are questions that really depend specifically on the scientific domain that you are concerned with. But what I want to suggest is that there are relations between these two levels in a way that I'm going to explain later. Now, you may wonder why I want to keep the distinction. So one reason why I want to keep the distinction is to foster a unity of philosophy of science rather than to crystallize the fragmentation. This may seem counterintuitive to you, but this is for me a way of having conceptual clarity, because I want to be able to use some cross-cutting questions in a way that also foster comparisons among domains. So for instance, if I need a specific concept of causation tailored to disease, so to the health sciences, there can be interesting questions of comparison with what happens in the social sciences, or even in physics, or in biochemistry, etc., or even some kind of permeability across these domains. But so as an exercise in conceptual clarity, the distinction is useful. Another reason for me to keep the distinction is to be able to say exactly where we lose this value neutrality. Okay, so in a sense, these questions will help me investigate scientific processes in a more precise way, and then see when or where values come in. And usually the question of values is posed at the very end. So we carry out our research and then we complain because after all it was value laden. And instead with asking the questions about how we come up with our concepts, I want to be able to ask the question about values much earlier in the process. So that's why I want to use the distinction, and it will come back later in the talk as well. So let me now give you a crash course on the philosophy of the health sciences and public health, which and I'm assuming that you are not familiar with this, and so that's why I thought it would be useful to step back a bit and see why this could be an interesting area to look at, even if maybe you are more used to discuss physics and the natural sciences more generally. So when you look at the special sciences, or what in the received view are considered the special sciences, the health sciences, medicine are a most recent addition to the range of options. It has taken a lot of effort to legitimize why philosophers of science should be interested in this field. And there are many reasons why they are interesting. There are very interesting questions about methods, because in the health sciences and public health, and I'm construing them as broadly as possible, you may have to do with very many methodological approaches, from the experimental to the observational to data-driven technologies, simulation, and you add. So you may pose the question in terms of complementarity, of integration, or of what fits what kind of research question, you name it. But there is a methodological question that is interesting to address. There are questions about concepts that surely are health related and at times are borrowed from biochemistry, and other times they are instead borrowed from social sciences. So here they are blurred or they are fuzzy. I don't know what way of characterizing would be most appealing to you, but in a sense they really pick and choose from different areas, and this makes health and disease less neat than what we may think. Then there are very important questions about action, because the health sciences don't stay just at the theoretical level, but at some point they have to inform diagnosis, prognosis, individual treatment, public health intervention. So there is an important connection to be made between the science and the action in general. And then there is a whole world of contextualization that need to be done at the historical, cultural, political level, and you name it. So there is quite a lot for each one of us, and depending on our own interest. So this is very general, but let me zoom in into one specific issue in the health sciences, and that is the way of conceptualizing health and disease. So using the previous distinction, this is a domain specific question. It is a question that is essential to the field, and that has its own tradition. And it is a tradition that is not monolithic, but that is already quite varied. And as you can imagine, it is a question that is metaphysical in character, but I will come back to this. Now, when you think of the traditions in the plural that try to define health and disease, you find at least biology, statistics, experimental studies, the social sciences, a political approach, an historical approach. All these different domains and approaches have tried to have a say about what health and disease are. Now, when you ask the question of what these things are, this is primarily a metaphysical question. But it is a metaphysical question that also has epistemological, methodological, and normative dimensions as well. And this is where for me at least, the issue becomes attractive, because you have a hard time really delineating clearly between the metaphysics and the rest. And I will tell you in a minute also what is my own take on how one should address this question. Now, my strategy here, I'm not sure what is happening, but hopefully everything is all right and you can still hear me and see my slides.
Yes,
Jay?
yes.
Okay, there was some during every here and there, but all fine. Okay, good. So my own strategy for this is the following. I want to tackle a domain-specific question, such as conceptualizing health and disease using cross-cutting concepts. How do I do this in practice is to appeal to a specific approach in philosophy of science, and that is the philosophy of science in practice. So I put the scientific practice first, and excuse me, the first question I ask is, how do we study health and disease? This then turns into inquiring about causes and mechanisms of health and disease. So to cut the long story short, the question, what is X, health and disease, I try to answer by how we study X. And if you're wondering, the answer is yes, I'm trying to derive metaphysics from epistemology in this case, which is of course contested and debatable, but that's how I want to do it. Because on the one hand, philosophically, I really want to link the conceptualization to the scientific practice. And then I want kind of to inject the philosophy into the scientific practice to see what difference it may make. And it does make a difference at the level of methods, of concepts, and of values and norms as well, as I hope to show you in the following part of the talk. So, right. So let me now dig into using causes and mechanisms of health and disease, so my cross-cutting concepts, to study or to define health and disease. The way I proceed is by first noticing that there are a number of practices in the health sciences at stake. You have biomedical research, you have clinical practice, you have EBM, evidence-based medicine, you have narratives, you have all the methodology behind the design of intervention, you have all of these things and much more that contributes to this exercise of conceptualizing health and disease. So there is this variety of practices to study what makes us healthy, what makes us sick. And what I think is interesting to look at specifically is studying factors that are biological and social. So I'm already introducing kind of two specific categories to look at causes and mechanisms. I would try to resist the attempts to over-biologize health and disease, or to reduce it just to the biological phenomenon. At the same time, I don't just want to make it like a social phenomenon that is only dependent on the social factors. One aspect that is interesting in this business is really the presence of both simultaneously, and that is going to be my specific focus in the later. Right. When I try to make this claim about the presence of biological and social factor, here there are already two dimensions at play. One dimension is descriptive, because it is a matter of fact that there exists plenty of research trying to establish correlations between social factors, health and disease, and biological factor. Okay, but then there is another dimension, and this is more normative, and this is where you start seeing how the conceptualization may make a difference. Now, often in this descriptive work, what scholars point at are the correlations between social factors and then health and disease. Whereas you may want to go a step further and make a stronger claim and say that the social factors are active causes in the mechanisms of health and disease. Now, if you want to make this a much stronger and normative claim, then you need to have an adapted concept of causation and or of mechanisms that can account for the mixed nature of health and disease. So I hope you start seeing where the tricky part is, because if you look at, let's say, the received view, it is easy to understand the sense in which a biological factor is a cause. We have a pretty good mechanistic understanding of how viruses work, bacteria work, they have an effect on the health. But it is a much less clear argument to be made of how a social factor, environment, social conditions, group interactions, individual preferences and choice can be active causes rather than just let's say background conditions. Okay, and this is why often times in the literature you may find the claim that social factors are the distant causes, but they are not proximate, because the proximate ones are the biological. And instead, what I would like to be able to argue is that social factors are proximate. But if you want to say this, then you really need to work hard on your concepts of causation and mechanisms. So I'm not going to be able to give you the full story, but just to give you a sense of how you can try and make this argument. Part of the argument is historical, to acknowledge that since at least the beginning of public health, social factors did play a major role, and then they kind of faded away. And this is why we came to characterize social factors as the causes of causes rather than as the proximate real causes per se. Okay, and there is a very well-established tradition in sociology of health and in social epidemiology that studies this steady association between health and disease and the social factors, the inequalities, or how health and disease happen in social context. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that nobody has looked at this. Quite the contrary is the case. We have a very long and established tradition, and it is an interesting historical argument to be made to see how they started from real causes and then faded away to just a background or background conditions or distant causes. If you want to argue for the proper causal nature of social factors, then you need to develop something that I would call the biosocial mechanisms, or the mixed causal nature of these factors. And this is where you enter into conceptual questions and methodological questions at the same time, because you need to combine them. So not just as social determinants, as distant causes, but really you have to be able to provide a concept of mechanisms in which you can have biological and social factors as active causes for health and disease. Now, this is easier said than done, but to begin with, there is some research that points in this direction. I mentioned here the Life Path project, that is the latest in a series of projects in epidemiology, and especially in molecular epidemiology. And in the latest part of their research program, now they are trying to link back all they have understood about, for instance, biomarkers of cancer, of asthma, or of a number of health conditions to social factors, social environment, and not just in a way as correlation, but really as to understand the way in which these social factors have a proper active component. So this is also one way in which you can read the attempts of epigenetics, for instance, but not only, or of what they are called the life course approaches. So to study the health and disease from in utero until much later in life, and where all these social factors and social conditions are appropriately studied. Okay. Now, more specifically, let me try to give you a sense of what this biosocial mechanism could be. A useful way of addressing this would be to start with the minimal definition of mechanism that I borrow from the work of philosophers Stuart Glennon and Phyllis Hillary. They say a mechanism for a phenomenon consists of entities or parts whose activities and interactions are organized as to be responsible for the phenomenon. Now, this is minimal because it is meant to be wide applicable across a scientific context. And for this very reason, some people have been deeply unhappy with this minimal definition, because in a sense, it abstracts quite a lot from the specific features of mechanisms in given context. But if you try to think of mechanisms of health and disease as being biosocial, then being so liberal about entities and activities is a plus, because then you can refer at once to a biological factor or to a social factor. So in a biosocial mechanisms, trying to explain COVID, since you were pressing me that I should talk about these things, certainly the virus as a biological entity does have a role, but you can't think of social factors such as your specific living conditions as just distant, because it is a direct cause, whether you have plenty of space in your house and can keep distance, or whether, for instance, you have a very tiny apartment with 5 people in there, and you are not privileged as we have been in working from home all the time, and so being so much exposed and bringing the virus home any minute. You see, so if you consider these social factors seriously, then they are part of a biosocial mechanisms to explain exposure and then infections to a virus such as the coronavirus. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
I don't mind taking questions now or later, so whatever. I'm happy with taking questions now.
I just wanted to ask why that is different from background condition.
Okay, so here you should go into another huge literature in the philosophy of causality, and the biggest reference would be Hart and Honoré, trying to explain this difference, especially in the context of legal causation. Okay. One of their stock example is if you light a match and this causes fire, presence of oxygen is a background condition. Okay, so a person would not be liable because in their home there is oxygen, right? But they would be liable because they lighted a match in a place where they wouldn't. Okay, so you can also say that the distinction between causes and background condition depends on what you are using or applying causation to. Okay, so in that context, I'm perfectly happy to consider oxygen as a background condition. In the case of COVID, I think we should push for considering your living conditions as causes and not as background conditions. And I hope to be able to convince you, and this will come in the next few slides, that if these living conditions are causes, then your interventions should tackle these living conditions, precisely because they are not just background, because you have to be able to intervene on these causal factors. Does it answer your question, Jay?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So feel free to interrupt me, and I don't see hands because I minimized the window, so just shout. Thanks. All right, so so that's the way in which I would try to characterize this biosocial mechanism. So I'm trying to use mechanisms as a cross-cutting concept that I used primarily epistemic, because I'm not fixing metaphysically what these entities are, but this will come later. And yes, you do take a stance about the metaphysics at some point, but primarily this is an epistemic understanding of mechanism. Okay. Now, this, I think, starts addressing the questions of Jay in a more elaborate way. So how we link the concepts to the actions. So my general argument is, if we conceptualize a concept as X in such and such way, then what actions should follow? And you can make this exercise with your favorite, health, evidence, probability. I mean, you do it, and you will see that there may be interesting results. So here, I think is interesting because the normativity is really double. So on the one hand, we start seeing why the philosophy of science concepts that we develop, causation, mechanisms, etc., are non-neutral. Okay, and the second one is that at some point you really want the philosophy to be part and parcel of the science or of the policy, and not just the cherry on the cake. So we let the scientists do the science, and then they come to me and say, oh, by the way, what is your beautiful understanding of causality? I don't know. I really want this beautiful understanding of causality to be maybe less beautiful, but more applicable, and to have some usefulness for the methodology, and then for the design of the actions that we have to make. Right. So the specific argument then is, if the social has an active role in health and disease, then what kind of public interventions should follow if you have really this understanding? Okay, and I hope I gave you already a sense with the COVID example that there is something to be debated there, right? The example I had in mind and I wanted to discuss with you is obesity and food labeling. COVID would be another excellent case in point, especially because we may be too quick in thinking that because we have isolated the virus, then the whole problem is biological, and it is not. Obesity clearly is much more controversial because obesity is at the same time something that pertains to the biology of the body of an individual, but also to the social environment. Let me try and explain what is at stake. So we have been focusing a lot on the COVID pandemic, but there is still an obesity epidemic, and possibly with so many of us staying working from home, this is becoming even worse than it was. There is a wide recognition of the role of social factors besides biological one. So in a sense, the obesity case is easier because nobody is going to contest that social factors do play a role. Social factors that can be the lifestyle, that can be how the consumption of food has changed also depending on the offer. There have been studies showing that McDonald's doubled the size of their hamburger, just to give you an example. And you can say, but this has nothing to do with social, but it has to do with social factors somehow. So nobody is contesting that, okay? That there are socioeconomic factors playing a role. Now, take, for instance, European health policy on the matter. Obesity or fighting obesity is a top priority. In several documents, they announce that they will directly tackle social factors, and especially they want to change behavior. Okay, and then one of the biggest action is regulating food labeling. Okay, what is my problem with food labeling? One problem I have with food labeling is that ultimately it is not about the social dimension of obesity, it's about the biology. Okay, because food labeling tells you this nutrient is good, this nutrient is bad, or it is 5 on a scale from 0 to 5, or they tell you how many portions of this type of food you should have a day. Okay, but they don't really consider how you link back the labeling to the social conditions. If you have a busy life and you travel a lot, which is of course not the case since the pandemic, or much less so, and in the automatic machine at the station you only offer biscuits and junk food, etc., you can label it, but you really don't tackle the behavior. Okay, so it is not the labeling that is about the behavior, not at all. Another problem I have is that in spite of claims to target food industry, in fact, all this kind of policy does is to oblige industry to make the information available, and then it is your individual decision what to do, whether to buy this food or not. And lastly, and this is another big worry, these kind of policies pull in opposite direction with instead policies at the economic level to improve on competitiveness of small and medium enterprises. And if you consider, for instance, that a number of European countries are leader in the wine sector, then you see that you may have quite a conflict there. Okay, so that's not the only one. So the point I'm trying to make is that it is not enough to claim that you will tackle social factors trying to change behavior. How you change behavior really does matter. And something like just imposing to label foods is not a way of changing or inducing change in behavior. Okay, so perhaps my stronger claim. There are questions, maybe.
Can I ask a quick question on this?
Sure.
On this example, like you mentioned it briefly, but I think, well, in this obesity example, there are also economic causes, right? Quite often the unhealthy food is actually cheaper than the healthy food. And does that, in your frame, in your way of looking at this problem, does that also mean that there should be sort of economic measures imposed to tackle this question?
Yes, exactly.
The economic factors costs are part of the cause as well.
Yes, exactly. Yes, I think, of course, I'm being very idealistic and say, yes, this is what we should tackle. In practice, this is very difficult to tackle. But what I want primarily to say is that if you really want to claim that these social factors, socioeconomic factors are active causes, then your example is a perfect case in point. What do we do with the price of food? Can you, as a government, step back and say, oh, but we are telling people that this is not healthy, that this is junk food, and who cares if they cannot afford it? Well, then it should be somebody's responsibility that if you cannot afford healthy food, then you are really not tackling the social part of the disease causation thing, you see? And so it is a call for us academics, whether philosophers, scientists, epidemiologists, etc., that whatever we say about obesity, COVID, or you name it, I mean, is not neutral at all. I mean, at some point we have to take a stance. Okay, I think you really got the one of the best examples, and you can think that this is so severe in the US, but it's not just in the US that this is creating a huge barrier to having healthy food. Okay, shall I go on? All right. So I think this question is a great introduction to the normative part that I want to develop. So. That these concepts are not just epistemological in character, not just methodological, relevant for methodology. They carry with them quite a heavy normative component. And this is how I want to rediscuss the non-neutrality of philosophy of science. Now, value ladeness is a concept that everyone nowadays is well aware of. Okay, especially because areas such as the social studies of science have carried out quite systematic investigations into the scientific processes in the plural to show how these practices are value laden. Okay.
Sorry, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Would you be able to explain value ladenness? Is because I know what it is, but I don't think everyone knows like this Kuhn's jargon.
Okay. Yeah. I'm getting into this in not in great details, but hopefully enough, Jay. But yes, I'll try to be a bit more specific then. Okay. Now, very often the question of value ladeness is posed. Actually, no, let me start again. The traditional way of posing the problem of value ladeness is to say that values influence our concepts and methods. And so in spite of the alleged value neutrality of science, scholarship in the social studies of science, in the social sciences more generally, in sociology of science, is to show that values really influence your concepts and methods. Okay. Now, but the second part is not so much studied, namely how our concept then influence the values that we promote. Okay. Please tell me if this distinction is somehow clear.
Yes.
So the usual setup is you take any example or case or episode of science where no discussion about the values typically happens, I mean, if you read the papers in scientific journals in the health sciences or in physics or whatever, they don't, okay? And then typically this is a sociologist of science coming along and say, no, 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 man, actually you do have values. So for instance, you could say, I want to find out that whether there is water on Mars. And you may want to make the claim that this has nothing to do with values, okay? And then the sociologist of science may come along and say, no, no, there are some values in this, and you have to try and spell out what these values are. They may be epistemic, they may be moral. You can push the argument even stronger, say, why do you want to look for water on Mars? And then not just for the intellectual curiosity, but maybe because if we find water on Mars, we understand some things better about our planet and find solution for places where there is no water, okay? If this is your line of argument, then values have a role in your scientific process, okay? But typically the quarrel is scientists taking a step back and say, this has nothing to do with values, and social studies of science say, no, no, you do have the values in your research, okay? Now, the way in which I want to pose the question is that is different. I want to say, look, the moment in which you use concepts, you develop these concepts, be careful, because the way in which you are going to develop these concepts is going to promote some values rather than others. And that's exactly what I was trying to elaborate on in the reply to Wow. Yes, so if you say a big problem with obesity is that junk food costs much less than healthy food, and you think that this is really a cause, this causal factor, and then you think you should regulate the food industry and the prices, I mean, you are taking a stance about the role of government and or the role of individuals. If you do this camouflage and say, I want to tackle the behavior, okay, and then you just do food labeling, in fact, you don't do it, implicitly, the value you are promoting is individual freedom and individual responsibility. It is just your individual business to do it, okay? I'm not taking a stance there of what is better than the other. I'm just saying, be aware that with these concepts, you are going to promote values. And this is very much in progress in my own thinking. But I guess that in banging on this role of social factors, I am going towards asking for more regulation, for more presence of the governments, for more responsibility, not just relegated to the individual action. So I think this is really where I'm going. Okay.
Can I ask you
sure.
It's maybe a sort of very naive question, but when you speak about obesity, you're speaking about it as a general problem. I mean, yes. because then I understand when you say, these factors make a difference in the numbers, the total numbers of obesity, right? But then the single individual, I mean, the causes, you could almost argue they're just logical in a way. I mean, the individual eats junk food, fine, but that's not a cause. The cause that he becomes obese is then completely biological. But when you see there's the total number statistically, then I guess this is where this discussion matters.
Yeah, exactly. That's why here the focus is primarily about what to do at the level of public health and not so much at the level of individual treatment. Because of course I'm not going to blame an individual if they have some kind of genetic dysfunctionality whereby they are obese, okay? And it is very possible that if this is the individual the reason for the obesity of this individual, the public health intervention just reducing the price will not make a difference to this individual. But when you look at the numbers for the population statistically, it does make a difference. Exactly. So there will be important distinctions to be made, whether you then want to see how this problem translates into individual treatment. Because likewise, Okay, so consider the example of smoking, whereby there is quite a lot of public health interventions going on. And then you could also imagine individual treatment to quit smoking, and the person doesn't. What should you do? Should you still give treatment to a person who does not comply with the treatment? There are a number of very tricky ethical questions that arise, and these are much trickier than the one that I'm trying to pose here, that are really at the population level and for the big numbers. Okay, so I think these slides repeat things I already said. So concepts such as health carry a normativity, and they carry normativity because one reason is that I link it to causation, and then causation in terms of has this kind of normativity. Okay, so I think I shouldn't spend more time on this because I'm repeating myself. Again, obesity, I think we discussed this already. Then what you want to do with the food labeling, the food industry, the marketing. I want to be able to say that the stance you take about these options does depend on how you conceptualize health and disease, and especially the causal role of certain factors. And so if you want to carry the discussion at the ethical level or the political level, to me this should include a discussion of how you conceptualize these things. Okay, which brings me to sum up and conclude, because I think I told you pretty much what I wanted to tell you. No, that's one thing I did not tell you, in fact. And I was carried away by my usual argument about the biosocial mechanisms. So one reason why I really wanted to tell you about this is that I was playing with the idea that contrary to the reductionist attempts that still exist, I was wondering whether one could imagine that the biological part of health and disease emerge from the social factors rather than the other way around. So that's the real work I wanted to do for the seminar, and that I was not able to do. And perhaps there is something true to it, or something more evocative than other. I'm not sure at this stage, but I was wondering whether one could really push the argument even further, not just say they are important, but they are even more basic, to the point that they are what let emerge the biological factors and the biological dimension of health and disease. But this I'll probably leave it for another occasion. I see that there is, okay, so recast, I was checking the chat. Let me conclude quickly, because we can spend some time on Q&A. So I started from this distinction of cross-cutting and domain-specific. It is an old distinction, but I think there is still some good use you can make out of it. And especially it helps me, at least, in seeing how the cross-cutting questions about causality, evidence, and explanation can be a way in which you may tackle a very specific question, or a domain-specific question, such as the one of health and disease. And so I try to explain to you how a specific conceptualization, causal conceptualization of health and disease can be given by giving social factors a more prominent active causal role. This is a controversial point on its own, despite there is abundant literature on the social factors on health and disease. And what I think becomes even more controversial is to discuss then what actions should follow. And I guess I'm posing this provocatively because I want to see the question discussed, not because I think I have all the answers to this problem. And so I guess my ultimate take-home message is that what is often considered abstract, conceptual, or just theoretical work of philosophers is instead fundamental, and not just because it has to do with the foundations, but especially because it has to do with what happens after you have the concept, what actions should follow. So if I can put it even more bluntly, the argument, leave me alone doing my nice philosophical stuff, does not work or does not work anymore, and somehow should be resisted. And somehow it is really a call for every one of us in reflecting upon what would be the consequences of conceptualizing whatever you want to conceptualize in a way rather than another. And so again, and to conclude really, I guess this is an argument for the broad societal relevance of philosophy, even beyond what we may want and what is usually recognized. And yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to present this idea at your seminar.
Thanks a lot, Federica. I guess we have time for some questions. Oh, I can see Janus has a question if he doesn't have background noise. Yeah.
Yes, I hope I think they're taking a lunch break next door. But so my question was about practical implications, because now you're speaking about scientists,
yeah.
But many policy decisions by the government, which seems to be what you're aiming at, are informed by institutes such as in the Netherlands, RIVM, CBS, and so forth. And the people working there, as far as I understand, they try to be neutral to inform that decision, and that also makes sense in the sense that you don't want the people doing the research to change every time a new government is formed. But what would be an alternative there for them to realize their non-neutrality in the concepts they choose to study? Or yeah, how does this look practically in terms of informing policy?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And I think it is a question that should be investigated systematically, partly with ethnographic methods, so descriptively to see how in different countries and for different areas, this process of design of policies happens. And then once you have a clearer understanding of how the process works, to understand where you can kind of inject these kind of considerations. Because I think you're totally right that people at the RIVM and the CBS, they try to be neutral, but you know, they will not be neutral, right? But of course, I can't just go to them and tell them, you know, you are not neutral, therefore you should tell the politicians this. So it is an open question, and one that has to be asked, how you change this process. Okay, and I can't answer this. This was something that I wanted to do in a research project that was not funded, unfortunately. But so I think you got exactly one part of the stake.
Is there any other question? Yeah. Clelia, you want to ask?
Yeah, I have a small question. So I don't know how related it is, but I was wondering how, like, when you choose to tackle a certain problem, you may actually also create other issue at the same time that you're tackling that problem. And how is this can be studied in advance in a way to, for example, if you're trying to tackle obesity, and for example, in Europe, we tend to tackle obesity more than in the US. And that might create some problem at the psychological level. So for example, people might feel discriminated just because they're a little bit overweighted, in particular at school, or people might feel unwell, or let's say very worried about their weight or their size, and more than in a society where weight and size are very diverse, like in the US. So there is a kind of a double that kind of create another issue somehow, and so how this can be tackled in a proper way.
Yeah. So again, this has to do with the process of policy design And what I think should be done there is if you enlarge the basket of what constitutes relevant evidence for your policy, then you may have means to anticipate some of these unattended consequences. So, for instance, if you really take seriously the psychological mechanisms that go with being an obese child, then the person or the group designing the policy should also look into this scholarship and not just on the, let's say, the biochemical studies on obesities, you see. And then you may have means, you cannot anticipate everything, but you can make an effort in anticipating some. And the argument to push for this biosocial disease causation is exactly that, because if the social is causal, then I want to look for studies about what happens psychologically to obese children, you see, and then I can take into account in how I design the intervention against obesity. For instance, you can imagine that therefore the officers doing the intervention, they have to have special training about how to talk to these children or to their parents. And there are best practices about that. But I guess the systematic argument has not been made. That's why I'm trying to push this line of argument.
But I'm thinking more at the population level. So if you're trying to tackle obesity in general, you will tackle it at the whole population level. Yeah. And so I'm thinking, are there some psychological studies of the impact of this type of I don't know, any policies that have been taken at the population level? So does it change, are teens more worried about their weight or things like that?
Yes, I think you're pointing to another big pink elephant in the room, namely that your actions may not be direct in the sense of the most direct causes, because I think what you're pointing at is, for instance, the self-perception. In that case, maybe you have to regulate advertising and marketing and challenging some role models, so that we all have to be tall and slim, right? And increase diversity in this sense. Now, this is interesting because this has nothing to do with obesity per se, but about cultural and social norms, that they are indirectly related to obesity, but they may have a major role long term and at the population level. So really, this is enlarging even more the basket of your evidence and how you can anticipate this causal network and how they may work out.
Thanks.
I have a naive question. I think maybe there's people here who also know the answer. I don't know. But are there like trying to put some modeling into this? Are there sort of models? Can you model obesity as some kind of complex system in which these socioeconomic factors are part of the conditions in the system? And can people see somehow obesity thresholds in the same way they see, epidemic thresholds? And I was just wondering if there's,
I don't know if they have done it for obesity, but I mean, a part of the work that is done at the IMC on diabetes using simulations and complexity approaches is very much in line with what I am saying. And maybe it will not be the whole story or the final answer of how you include the social factors into the picture, but I think it is a very valuable attempt to study this systematically and on a par with the biological factors. So yes, Jay, there is something going on about this.
All right. Does anyone have any other question? Peter?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Federica. I mean, maybe also a very naive question, or maybe this is an open door. I mean, do your results completely translate to basically all aspects of human life and society, because I can imagine that this also holds for economic policy, for living standards, for well, all kinds of things that people encounter in life. So what is your viewpoint on that? So how does it translate to other sides of life?
Yeah,
except for health?
I want to answer your question not directly, but by introducing a nuance, because so on the one hand, causal methods have been highly specific. Biology studies biological causes, physics studies physics causes, sociology studies groups causes in social dynamics, etc. Okay. And if you go to systemic approaches, everything causes everything else, or everything is connected to everything else. And in this interconnectedness of everything, you can't really disentangle causes. And I think you are pointing into what is the reality of things, that in the reality, everything is messed up because of my past history and my social conditions and what I am now and the people I met and whether I took the bus yesterday. I mean, all these things may explain why I'm giving the talk today, but that is not what is going to help designing an individual treatment for me if I have a specific disease or a public health intervention at all, you see. So I guess I'm saying this to tell you that there must be some or some useful threshold between separating the areas and the causal factors and trying to put them, more of them together to explain a part of the complexity. The full complexity, we will not be able to explain it, right? But going too much in the direction of isolating the causes that are domain specific is not going to help either. And in between the two extremes, I would like to have on the table the discussion of what is the right middle ground. Now, you can also say that we can do some of these things because today we have some methods. So the computational methods used by this group studying diabetes across the IMC and the IES, well, we didn't have these computational methods probably 40 years ago, so we are not going to blame history for that. But now that we have them, we should continuously ask the question of conceptualization and what value does it bring, right? So yes, this argument can extend to other areas of life because economic policies are very similar to public health policies. And so, yes, but this is where you have to balance the two kind of the need causes and the complexity mess, if you see. Yeah. I hope this, I captured what you wanted to ask, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it may be also not completely clear what I was thinking, but okay, so what I got from your talk was that we really need to separate value or normative thinking and with the precise domain specific questions and the science that's behind that. Okay, so if I'm that's what I got at least from your presentation. And I was thinking, this is of course true for health, where you do have this interconnectedness. But it's also true for technology. I mean, for what's it called, electronic devices and so on, smartphones and that kind of stuff. Exactly the same. So everyone is doing technological driven development, but nobody is really wondering about the norms behind that. And these are also social, and there's lots of aspects connected to these type of things.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, yes, and yes. I think you have an interesting analog there. There is a lot of ethics of technology, ethics of AI that is done as the watchdog post hoc. You first do the thing and then you ask, oh, is it good or is it not? And instead, you should ask the question from the beginning. I would like to develop the next mobile phone that I don't know what it does. Why? Is it good? What kind of values am I going to promote if I put on the market an object like this? Exactly. Yes, it is precisely the same type of reasoning. And this is something that I was trying to investigate with two colleagues. We got a seed money grant from the Humane AI research priority area. And we did much less than we wanted to, because of course we had this during the pandemic, but we have a draft paper that exactly makes this argument of how you should include the values already at the design stage, and so not carry out this ethics assessment just at the end of the process and after everything has happened.
Yeah, right. Okay, thanks for explaining that.
Thank you for the question.
Are there any more questions?
Well, maybe a short one, or more like a remark or something. Like when you were discussing the value laddenness of concepts in science, I got to think that quite often, sort of, if you talk to curiosity-based scientists or people that just they about their motivations or why are they doing things, they could list a whole bunch of applications, but at the end of the day they would say something, well, I'm doing this because I'm just curious, I want to know, and I can solve this problem, I have the background to do it, and that's why I want to do this. And so I have the feeling somehow that sort of sometimes values are also imposed on scientists, right? Because you can't write in your paper like, we study this because I think this is interesting, it won't get published. You can't write in your grant application, I study this because I think and you won't get the grant.
No.
So there's a way in which those values are also imposed from outside, or even maybe not even actively imposed, but more like passively imposed. Like the scientists themselves would think like, I cannot get away with saying this, I have to think of something better,
I think it is even more complicated than this, for the following reason, that what you have in mind is probably the individual researcher and still early in their career, and possibly in context where it won't make a difference. So all these army of Marie Curie fellows that do a postdoc for 2 years, they certainly do it out of curiosity, and you don't want to tie the hands of curious people, because this is what takes science to the next stage, right? And then you have these big research programs where you get 10 millions or even more in large consortia. And there it is not so much the curiosity. It is either because they want the money, because this is the fashionable topic, etc. And then we put under the carpet the problem of values, or because we are responding to values that are already imposed by who is writing the work program. Okay, so it's not that I want to blame scientists for this. It is really complicated to investigate, and where do you put the boundaries? I'm not sure, right? Because you certainly have to make an effort and anticipate the ethical consequences of what you want to research, or the technology you want to develop. But where do you put exactly the limit and say, no, you don't do it? And maybe if you do it, then something much better comes afterwards. I mean, we have very bad examples in the history of science and technology, but we also have very good examples of things we discovered and they were not intended. But I feel that if we don't have a honest and frank discussion about this, we are bound to make more mistakes than if we simply ignore that the problem is there.
Okay, thanks very much. I don't see any more questions, so thank you again. Another round.
Thank you. And I promise that if I am able to give a bit more of thought of how the biology emerges from the social, I let you know. So that.
Thanks. Yes. I'll stop.